You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Brine, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. We've come a long way as far as technology goes, and many of us take for granted good internet connections into our houses and out into our area. But for many parts of rural Ontario, the good broadband and the good internet connection has not quite made it there yet. And it's a major problem as we get with more farms that are requiring more and more of the internet and more capacity there, that many of these farms just simply don't have that access that they should have. Today, we're talking with Dr. Helen Hambly of the Regional and Rural Broadband Project, and we're going to be talking about the state of rural broadband in Ontario. Helen, welcome to the Back 40.
Hi, Mike. I'm pleased to be here with you.
Could you give our listeners a little bit of an introduction as to who Helen Hambly is, and tell us a little bit about the Regional and Rural Broadband Project?
I'd be happy to, Mike. I'm the project leader for the Regional and Rural Broadband Project. It's also called R2B2. Sounds a little bit like something out of Star Wars. And yeah, I'm from that generation. And we are talking about digital and machines and being connected to the World Wide Web when we look at the research issues of the day. And the ones that we're concerned with are the economic and the social outcomes of rural broadband, the importance of being connected in today's modern world, and the importance of using digital technologies on farm, but really in all aspects of rural life. And as regions, we're in Canada, we're often best understood as regions of a very large country. And where rural broadband is concerned, it tends to be a regional network infrastructure that has some high-speed corridors as well as some other connections that get out to that last mile, which is typically the farm. So I'm doing research on these issues at the University of Guelph in the Ontario Agricultural College since about 2007. We're the oldest and the largest research project on rural broadband in the country. And we network all over the world with collaborators in the United States and Europe to really sort of look at how to understand this area of investment and policy making, to collect relevant data, to analyze it, and to respond to questions that come in from municipalities and the public, who are major stakeholders, of course, of connectivity in Ontario. That's a little bit of a nutshell, but I should add that I'm a farm kid by background. I did work a good chunk of my life outside of Canada, in Africa and in Latin America and in Asia. But I came home in 2003. And when I joined the University of Guelph, I had been living in the Netherlands for about 8 years, working for an international agricultural research organization. And when I came for my interview, Mike, you wouldn't believe it. They said, we're really pleased, Dr. Hambly, with all your international work, but what are you going to do back here at home? And I said to them, well, I have to tell you, I can't use my cell phone when I go out to my brother's farm. And I'm having a difficult time understanding why connectivity in Canada is such a challenging area. So maybe I'll do some work around that. Well, famous last words. And a few years later, the Regional and Rural Broadband Project started going. That's how I've reached this point. 17, 18 years later, I'm really pleased to see the accomplishments of the research project and know it has a home at the University of Guelph.
Having been in the countryside and driven through the countryside for many years while trying to connect with a telephone, I can tell you that it's not unusual for us to have a dropped call, and it certainly is much better than it used to be. But there's still some areas where that cell coverage is just a little bit on the spotty side. How bad is the lack of connectivity out in rural Ontario?
So let me start by saying a little bit about broadband, explaining a little bit about what that word means. Broadband is a word that basically means higher speed or faster, more reliable internet access. And we can gain access to the internet through our devices in a number of different ways. So one is with a mobile connection. So that's things like our cell phone, for instance. And mobile broadband tends to be the highest cost per megabit. And that's the more expensive one, the mobile broadband. And many folks who live out in the rural areas know how their cell costs or mobile costs are fairly substantial sometimes because they may have a data cap or a limited amount of data that they can access each month. And they may also find some significant costs around the types of plans that they have access to in their local area. The other kind of connections are connections that go into the premise. So this would be going into the house or maybe into a barn. And these are both wired and wireless connections. In the rural areas of Canada, fixed wireless access, especially here in Ontario, is very common on the farms. And there's also satellite connections. To a very limited extent, there would be cable modem connections. These are more typical of urban fringe areas or urban areas. And then, of course, the gold standard in broadband is fiber optic, and fiber to the premise is still something very rare in the rural areas of most regions across Canada. We measure broadband access with a target here in Canada. It's called the Basic Service Objective, or BSO. And the BSO is 50 megabits per second download and 10 megabits per second upload, and a latency around 50. So it could be 42 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds. So this is the basic service objective set out by the CRTC and the federal government, and we measure against that speed threshold. Now, most of your listeners will know that in many rural areas, a 50-10 connection to the internet is still not attainable, but others will have 50-10 and even much higher. So I live on the outskirts or the south side of Guelph, Ontario, and my connection at home is around 150 megabits per second down and about 60 megabits per second up. So I'm well above that speed target or speed threshold that the federal government uses. But as I said, many rural areas aren't even at the 50-10. And in fact, there's around 12% of communities in Ontario today that are quite low, around 5 or 6 megabits per second down. That means that email is possible, but certainly any kind of streaming, video streaming, or any type of data intense application would run into difficulty. 50-10 will certainly allow you to stream a little bit, but certainly it can buffer. You may lose signals and find documents not downloading properly. So the rural areas do get very frustrated by a lower speed and a less reliable connection than the urban areas have.
I've worked on dial-up, I've worked on high-speed, and I'm fortunate to be in one of the few areas in rural Ontario that I actually have fiber optic into the house. I have extremely good internet connection, but I do talk to a lot of people that particularly have a lot of difficulty getting any sort of speed out of the internet there, and they struggle to reach those thresholds that you talked about. How many farmers would we be looking at, or how many rural people would we be looking at that wouldn't get that type of minimum levels we're asking for there?
At national level in Canada, it's about 47% of rural Canada cannot reach that 50-10 megabits per second threshold, that basic service. And in Ontario, it's about 37%. So relatively in Ontario, we're a little bit better off, but still at almost 40%, it's still a concern. The data and the numbers that give us these big percentages also are hiding a lot of things. So when you look at different regions, 37% could actually climb upwards to 50%. So we do have some regions where rural users, it's about 50% of them can't get the 50-10 megabits per second connections. It's just not available. In some cases, availability has to be balanced with affordability. It could be available, but you certainly wouldn't be able to afford perhaps that speed. And another aspect is that the type of connection, if you're on a satellite connection, if you're on a fixed wireless connection, these types of connections, they affect the extent to which you can achieve these higher speeds. So fiber optic, the 1 gigabit per second synchronous, both download and upload speeds are certainly possible, whereas you cannot get those speeds out of satellite, for instance, and certain fixed wireless systems are also challenged to be able to reach those kinds of speeds. So these are the challenges facing rural areas. The other side of the affordability equation, Mike, is that prices in rural areas are significantly higher. That's the research that we've done at the University of Guelph showing there's significantly higher prices in the rural areas for broadband. And that part of this challenge is that there's limited competition locally between providers. You may have only 1 or 2 providers locally. You might have a wireless provider and then one of the larger incumbents incumbent providers. These are the Bell, Rogers, and TELUS of Canada, and very little choice, say, compared to being in an urban environment where you might have half a dozen or more options in terms of your connectivity. So that affects affordability. What's interesting from our research, Mike, is that rural users actually show a higher willingness to pay for higher speeds. So it's not the case that rural users aren't willing to pay a bit more. The data that we've analyzed shows that that's actually not the case. Rural users want better broadband and they demand more reliable, faster connections and are willing to pay more for this. But at the same time, compared to their urban neighbors, the rural users pay much higher costs per bit for their connections.
So is the problem, like many things that we face out in the countryside here, we're spread out quite a distance here. I know my closest neighbor is more than a quarter mile away, and there's quite a good spacing between most of us there. The infrastructure and the cost of putting that infrastructure, is that the main thing that holds back companies from investing out in rural Ontario?
Yes, certainly when they do some of their business planning, the choice of investing and strengthening their services in an urban area doesn't compare as favorably to a rural area because it is more expensive to offer service over these larger distances. But in some cases, the infrastructure is not available for some of the smaller providers to gain a license to the backbone of the network and resell services. So sometimes there's a business case and sometimes there's not. I always argue that where broadband is concerned, you have to have that regional perspective and that local perspective, because what you might see happening around your area of southwestern Ontario, one or two counties over, may be a completely different case. And the business on the numbers side, it might look like it's the same number of premises, so same number of households, same number of square kilometers, and maybe even the same amount of wired connections. But the business case doesn't exist there as compared to another area. So it is very locally specific. Also depends on the competition that might already be based in that area. And as I said, the willingness of the incumbents, the three big companies, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, own 91% of the backbone of broadband in Canada. And they not only own that and have those assets, but they also then license it to other companies to sell service. And they compete with those companies because, as you know, you can also get a Bell connection to your home, possibly Rogers, and in some parts of Canada, TELUS connections. So the big companies also compete with the small companies, and the big companies own the lion's share of the wired backbone of broadband networks.
And that's one reason why I'm so fortunate where I am now. I'm on that 9% that's not owned by the major three there. I'm with a cooperative phone company, Quadro Communications, that has spent a lot of money making sure that they have fiber optic into each and every one of their customers. And they're still continuing to have that as something that they consider to be very important. Where does the Regional and Rural Broadband Project fit into trying to help out on this?
So when we created the Regional and Rural Broadband Project, and we started off with research grant from OMAFRA, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, to sort of set up the design of the project and test some of our research questions. When we moved on from that funding, we started to partner with regional broadband networks across Ontario and also to participate with broadband initiatives across the country. And so our work was really to look at this issue around the data and the information around rural broadband, to partner with regional initiatives, to support municipalities who wanted to make a change locally in the internet access that their residents and businesses had. And as a result, we embarked on a number of different projects. The largest project to date has been with the Southwest Integrated Fiber Technology Network. This is SWIFT, as it's known in southwestern Ontario. It includes Niagara Region and Caledon in Peel. And it was set up by the Western Ontario Wardens Caucus, who did a rather remarkable thing at the time. Back in 2014, they created a collective, a group effort to say we all share a concern and a need for better broadband in our region, in our rural areas. And so how can we team up and get the federal and the provincial government on board, as well as collaborate with our crucial private sector organizations? These are the large telecom organizations, as well as the small ones like Quadro that you mentioned. And so why don't we team up as a public-private partnership and get something moving here? That was the initiative that became known as SWIFT, and we had successive changes in provincial government, as well as some delays in getting everything signed, sealed, and delivered. But this year, we will see that $209 million investment completed with over 100 projects, more or less, across southwestern Ontario for better broadband. The largest proportion of investment will go to fiber optic connections. A small amount will be going to fixed wireless last mile connections in that program. You'll see that all levels of government have teamed up to make this happen with the private sector. And so this is a huge initiative. And R2B2 project at the University of Guelph has been a research partner in this effort, collecting data, including surveys that we invite households across southwestern Ontario to complete to tell us about their needs for internet. We set a baseline so that after this investment is completed, we can measure the economic outcomes for the region of this investment. So tell the story back to taxpayers. What difference did this $209 million make? So that's part of our role. And as well, we try to share the experience from southwestern Ontario right across the rest of Canada. The tools that we've developed, including the economic modeling, the mapping, information resources, we share right across the country to partners out in Alberta and British Columbia or in the Maritimes that are doing the same thing. They're looking for information, for data, for ideas, for ways forward in better broadband for their rural areas. So it is quite a remarkable thing that what grew here in southwestern Ontario can be shared right across the country.
Do you like what you're hearing from the Back 40? We'd like to hear from you. Send us an email with your comments and thoughts to theback40@trilliummutual.com or follow us on social media @Trillium Mutual. The research that you talked about, where you're going to go back and try and measure the economic impact that that $209 million of infrastructure improvements has made, that's going to be key in the future, though, for getting additional funding and getting additional communities with better internet, because you're going to be able to point to the fact that we spent this money, this is what we got back out of it. So it would make sense to invest some more money into rural broadband in Ontario.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you about one area of economic modeling that's been interesting for us. A couple of years ago, we started it, and it's the ability to work from home. So let's think what life was like before COVID-19, when we had to stay at home and work from home and go to school from home. Before that, the R2B2 project started modeling the telecommuter surplus. So this is basically a fancy word that means how much money do I save or do I keep in my pocket because I can work 2 or more days a week from home? And so the surveys that we had been delivering through southwestern Ontario, through SWIFT, and also with other partners like City of Hamilton and Durham Region, asked questions to folks about how many days a week you could work from home and whether or not you had the internet connection to do so. And so when we started calculating this, we could see that on average, in southwestern Ontario overall, the first telecommuter in a household would save that household about $20,000 a year. That's not insignificant. When there was a second telecommuter, the telecommuter surplus would go up between $6,000 and $8,000 a year additionally. And this meant that there was time saved from not having to commute. There was less commuting on the road, that the folks who could work from home could do so. Then COVID-19 hit, Mike, and boy, this telecommuter surplus really took off. We know that even things like carbon emissions from taking cars off the road, driving into the city and driving back out of the city, air pollution improved. Well, we also know this in terms of the savings in households who did have workers at home who could stay off the roads. And that meant the people who had to be on the roads, the trucks or the essential workers or the people who had to commute, had a less congested experience. So COVID-19 has just sort of proven why internet in rural areas helps people to work from home, to have the opportunity to do so. It may even mean that rural residents stay living in rural and small towns, and that there's less likelihood that they would move away because they have to move away to find a job. So we already know that. We also know now in some of our economic modeling that internet access improves the value of a rural property. It varies across the regions, but rural internet access at a premise actually does potentially improve the value of your property. And so COVID-19 just reinforced the importance of improved connectivity in rural areas, and it grew the demand. And in fact, the research that we've done has also shown how rural internet users will have multiple plans. Unlike in the city where I just have one internet connection at my home, there is a sizable number of households, it's around 20% or so, who have multiple connections because they always want to be on. They need a reliable internet connection. The best data I can see that points to this recently has been collected by the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. Again, one of the R2B2 project's partners over the last number of years on rural internet. And in a recent survey in 2020, about 2/3 of the respondents, 64%, said my business on farm would suffer without internet. And 5 years before that, it was around 60% of responses, my business would suffer without it. So we can see that more and more farm businesses know that there is value in this internet connection, and it helps them to participate meaningfully in the economy and to build, globally relevant businesses.
As we go forward with technology, farms are becoming far more complex. And a lot of that means that they're going to be connected through to the internet. Certainly, dairy is a great example of that, but other industries as well, where a lot of the equipment is connected through onto the internet, and people have access through that so that they can tell what's going on from their phones. But that doesn't happen unless we've got a good internet connection. How far away are we from getting almost everybody on some sort of fiber optic network here? Or is that even a reasonable goal for us to set?
I think at the regional level, more fiber optic penetration is absolutely essential. Will it be 100%? Absolutely not. There will still be a fixed wireless, maybe even a satellite set of connections for folks in rural areas. We also see new market entrants. So SpaceX, this is a company owned by Elon Musk, and the Starlink satellite, next generation satellite service, it is starting to be adopted across some parts of rural Ontario. So we also know that technologies will continue to emerge that will get faster speeds in fixed wireless as well as satellite. So there's no doubt there. But going back to that 2020 study by the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, they found out that about 21% of their 1,300 responses said that I didn't invest in new farm technology because my internet connection is inadequate. Well, that's pretty sobering. If almost a quarter of farms are not investing in new farm technology because they have a poor internet connection, we should be concerned as a provincial economy, as a national economy, because of the importance of agriculture. I do have data that shows that those farms that are on high-speed internet access are more willing and certainly do adopt precision agriculture technologies. And this is going to change. The market there and the market opportunity is significant. In Ontario, they're predicting about a 500% increase in precision agriculture technologies over the next couple of years. And if this is really going to meet the expectation, then we must have stronger broadband networks across the province in the agricultural areas. If we don't, we may see some challenges around productivity loss. We may see some data security and data loss issues emerging without a robust broadband network. I certainly think farmers and folks in rural areas will lose opportunities to study and learn and train and network because a lot of these learning opportunities are now online, and they can't access weather information, market information, etc., through their mobile broadband networks. That's already one of the big applications of digital technology on the farm. But I would say that next generation of technological development is going to be held back by a lack of better broadband.
That's going to affect our competitiveness in the market on a world stage as well, then.
Absolutely. That's something that the federal government, the provincial government are very much aware of. In the R2B2 project, we would argue for alliances, sort of innovation alliances between telecommunications and agriculture industry. We'd also encourage a focus on parallel infrastructure investments. So when you're investing, say, for instance, in energy pipelines and improved and smart energy systems, that at the same time you're looking at breakouts of fiber optic into rural, residential, and farm areas. These are the next set of innovations that will be possible in a sort of a coordinated and broad-based approach to broadband.
I read an article a couple of years ago, and it was a writer from down in the States, and he had a picture of one of his high school aged children in the back of a pickup truck on a hill at the back of his farm because it was the only place that they could pick up any sort of connection at all to submit one of their assignments. And I'm thinking, it's not just us, at least some other places struggle with this same problem, that because of the distances, it makes it very difficult to make an economic argument as to why we should improve that infrastructure and the fiber optic network. You mentioned that you had $209 million in funding and that project was nearly wrapped up. Where do you get the funding for R2B2?
R2B2's funding comes through partnerships with initiatives like SWIFT, but we also have a partnership, as I mentioned, with City of Hamilton and Durham region. We don't have private sector partnerships. You don't want to be biased by telecoms industry partners. So when it comes to dollars for the project, it comes through federal, provincial, or municipal government, and then also through research funding that the University of Guelph can seek from different special initiatives.
You mentioned 37% of rural people have inadequate broadband access. So I would imagine that there is a fairly good demand out there. Have you been approached by a lot of municipalities with ideas where you're going to be able to help them?
We're working with like very large municipalities as well as the small ones. The capacity development of municipalities or local government where broadband is concerned is extremely important. The smaller municipalities and the township level, they may lack the administrative capacity and expertise to be able to work with providers and negotiate and collect the information and participate in sort of new broadband projects. So they might team up at the county level and then even at the regional level, for instance, like the Western Ontario Wardens Caucus, to address the issue for residents and businesses in their area. The larger municipalities, they will hire a broadband strategy specialist or someone who coordinates the applications to public funding, as well as interactions, negotiations, discussions with private sector businesses in their area. And it is part of economic development generally, because some of the smaller providers are local businesses, family-owned businesses, sometimes cooperatives. And so the regions and the larger municipalities and counties will interact with these private sector organizations all the time, building their capacity to do that, but also to strategically plan, maybe to take municipal dollars and invest strategically in certain assets like a cell tower, or to make sure that when roads are being dug up, that there is conduit laid so that if fiber optic is a future opportunity, it's much, much less expensive if the conduit's there to be able to shoot the fiber optic through the community and get everybody on fiber. So we will support and follow these kinds of issues with municipalities all the time in our work, and share best practices and connect people maybe from one side of the province to another to talk about their experiences and how they got their community connected.
So where is the future for broadband in Ontario? It seems that we've been playing catch up for a lot of years on this, and with a high percentage still not having the adequate broadband connectivity, we still have a long way to go. But where do you think we're going to be 10 years down the road on getting connectivity out in the rural areas?
Yeah, so let me start with 5 years down the road. And the reason I'm going to say that is because we have a lot of money right now in play in terms of public investment. There is now $2.75 billion committed under the Universal Broadband Fund to get communities who are below that 10 megabits per second speed threshold connected. And these are applications that started coming in last year. And the first set will be through the program in August. And then there's an additional $1 billion committed by the federal government on April 19th of this year. Then there is additional funding that is being committed by the federal government in next generation satellite. And this includes the LEOs, the low Earth orbit capacity, to get this next generation of satellite connectivity projects moving. There's a big science, research, and innovation funding in that area as well. We have funding for projects in northern Canada, projects in that area that are benefiting First Nations communities. OMAFRA have been involved with funding EORN. This is the Eastern Ontario Regional Network, and the Southwestern SWIFT Network in the early days. But now the current Investing in Ontario infrastructure program is called ICON, Improving Connectivity for Ontario. And that program is $1.25 billion. And then in the provincial budget this year, the Ministry of Infrastructure hasn't got a name for its new program just yet, but they committed another $3.7 billion. So you can see that we're talking billions of dollars of investment that have already started being rolled out over the last couple of years. So over the next 5 years, a lot of builds, a lot of projects, more and more connections, especially for those communities that are below 10 megabits per second. But for the 10-year period, if we go past 2030, we know that 5010 will not be fast enough for the kinds of digital technologies that are evolving. So we will need to see scalable infrastructure that can be adapted and scaled to much faster speeds, because that's what is going to be needed in the future. And we will see a whole new ecosystem of digital technologies on farm. Our farms will not just be connected, they will be interconnected, even outside of agriculture, into areas like health, environment, manufacturing. And we will see deeper and deeper digital systems and ecosystems evolving by 2030.
And the biggest question there is, yes, we're spending a lot of money, and yes, we're bringing people up to the levels that we need to have them at. But what about in the future? Are we going to have the infrastructure there to be scalable that we can take forward? Because we know that farms are going to be relying more heavily on technology as we go forward. There's no question about that.
And there's definite benefits of deeper digital connectivity through rural areas for all Canadians, whether you're in rural areas or whether you're in urban areas. We know that these digital systems can bring benefits to the economy in terms of new lines of employment, new ways of working, new ways of training or studying, as well as creating economic opportunities for new products. There's also opportunities with social services. Telemedicine, telehealth into rural areas that is much better, more sophisticated than it is currently. But we can see in COVID-19 how important good information, accurate information, locally relevant information is during the pandemic. This is only going to become more important for both human health and animal health in the future. And then let's talk about the third area of benefit, and that's the environment. Valuing what farmers know and do in terms of the natural landscape, making sure that the data presents evidence for very good environmental decision making, whether it's related to climate change, mitigation, or any aspect of the natural environment. Let's remember that what we're doing now will have an impact down the road, and it might mean that Ontario stays strong, Canada stays strong in the face of a lot of challenges that we're yet to face.
It sounds like it's going to be a huge challenge. Do you think that we're going to meet the requirements then? It sounds like you're quite optimistic.
I am. We need good policy. We need good partnership between private sector and public sector in this area of broadband. We need an appreciation of what's happening in rural areas. The one thing, Mike, I saw this year actually made me feel good was urban folks who left the cities to go to smaller towns. Maybe it was just an Airbnb rental, or maybe it was folks who live in the urban area most of the year, but then made their cottages or their seasonal homes their permanent home. I was really impressed this year by the number of people who I heard in the urban areas stand up for rural internet and say, I had no idea it was that bad or that expensive, and this is not right. And so I was encouraged by that. I think coming out of the pandemic, we can't let that go. We really are all in this together.
It certainly has put it in the spotlight. It certainly has brought it to the attention of a lot of people. And I guess, as you say, that now's the time to take advantage of that and make sure that we don't lose the momentum after we're out of the pandemic and we're not having to all work from home. We do get to go back to the office a bit. Well, we can't forget that we still need to have that rural infrastructure as well.
We're not going to know what life is like off the internet ever again. That cow is already out of the barn. I would say that now it's a matter of just asking ourselves, where do we go in terms of making really good decisions? Where's the best, most reliable data for making these decisions? Making sure that every dollar spent is efficiently spent on a system that's going to stand up over time and be accessible, be affordable, be reliable for the users who need it.
We've been talking to Dr. Helen Hambly from the Regional and Rural Broadband Project, and we've been talking about the state of the broadband in rural Ontario. Join us next time when our guest will be Crystal Mackay, and we'll be talking about public trust in the Canadian food system. Helen, thank you very much for joining us today on the Back 40.
Thanks, Mike. It's been my pleasure to draw attention to the continuing work in regional and rural broadband in Ontario. And I want to wish you all the best in your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to the Back 40, brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Be sure to subscribe to the Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.